Before humans walked this earth, something else was already here, not waiting in the shadows of prehistory to be discovered by our ancestors, but already present, building, organising, establishing the very structures that humanity would later inherit. The evidence for this claim sits today in climate-controlled darkness beneath a museum in Philadelphia, inscribed in wedge-shaped marks on baked clay that has survived 4,000 years. The tablet measures roughly 8 inches tall. Its catalogue number is CBS 1673. 6 columns of text, 3 per side, each containing between 10 and 15 lines of cuneiform script pressed into the clay when it was still wet. The University of Pennsylvania excavated it from the ruins of Nippur in 1893, part of America's first archaeological expedition to Mesopotamia. For decades, it sat in storage, one fragment among thousands, until scholars pieced together what it actually says. What makes CBS 10673 unusual is not that it contains a creation story. Ancient Mesopotamia produced many creation narratives. What makes it unusual is when the story begins. Most creation myths start with gods creating the world, then creating humanity to inhabit it. This one doesn't. It starts with cities that already exist, with rituals being performed, with a world already functioning before the line that reads, in Sumerian, mankind was given breath. The text doesn't explain how those cities came to be there. It doesn't describe their construction. It mentions them the way you might mention the sky or the ground, as things that simply are. Eridu gets named first. Then the tablet records divine ordinances, the establishment of sacred rites, the proper functioning of temples. All of this proceeds in orderly fashion across the columns. Then, almost as an afterthought later in the text, the creation of humanity appears, not as the climax of the story, but as one event among several in a sequence that was already unfolding. If you read it literally, setting aside what it might symbolize or mean metaphorically, the text describes a world that was occupied before humans arrived. The question that follows is simple and deeply unsettling. What happened on that earth? What was occurring in those cities during that time when, according to these Sumerian records, we were not yet here? Before we go further, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city or country in the comments and let me know what time it is where you are as you hear this. There's something fitting about exploring the question of before while the world around you settles into quiet. The conventional explanation frames these texts as mythology, symbolic narratives explaining origins through metaphor and divine action. Scholars note that creation myths often telescope time, that ancient peoples didn't distinguish clearly between mythic time and historical time, that these stories serve theological and social purposes rather than chronological ones. All of that is true, carefully documented, broadly accepted. But something else is also true. The Sumerians, whoever they were, whatever we understand about their worldview, wrote these texts as records. They copied them carefully across generations. They stored them in temple libraries and scribal schools. They treated them not as fictions, but as accounts of what had occurred. The genre itself, the Sumerian term for these compositions, suggests historical memory, not invented narrative. They called them, roughly translated, old words or ancient sayings, words that had come down from before. This creates a peculiar problem for interpretation. Either these texts are purely symbolic, in which case their specificity about cities, rulers, time periods, and sequential events is merely decorative, or they are attempting to preserve something, some cultural memory, some transmitted knowledge about a time their own civilization remembered as, different from their present, a time when, as the tablets repeatedly state, kingship had not yet descended from heaven and mankind had not been created. The world described in these pre-human passages is not empty, it is active. Deities perform labour, they dig canals, They complain about the burden of their work. They hold assemblies where decisions are made. They establish rules and assign responsibilities. One text, the Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets in the British Museum, spends almost 300 lines describing the frustration of lower-ranking gods who must toil endlessly to maintain irrigation systems and produce food. The detail is bureaucratic, almost mundane. These are not cosmic beings speaking universes into existence through pure will. They are entities engaged in difficult physical work over extended time with organizational problems that require solutions. The solution they devise, according to these texts, is us. Humanity appears in these narratives as a created workforce, beings fashioned specifically to take over the labour the gods find burdensome. This is stated explicitly, repeatedly, across multiple independent compositions. The goddess Ninmah and the god Enki shaped the first humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, and the purpose is clearly articulated: to bear the yoke, to do the digging, to free the divine beings from physical toil. If this is purely metaphor, it is a strange one. It grants no special dignity to humanity's origin. It doesn't place us at the centre of creation or suggest we are beloved children of benevolent deities. It describes us as late additions to an already functioning system, purpose-built for specific tasks. The text doesn't celebrate this. It simply states it, matter-of-factly, the way an administrative document might note the hiring of new workers. But before any humans were created, before that solution was implemented, there was the time that the texts keep referencing but never fully describe. The time when the work was being done by others. The time when cities already stood and civilization already operated. The time, as the Sumerian king list records it, when 8 kings ruled for impossibly long periods before the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven anew. Those 8 kings. Their reigns are counted in tens of thousands of years. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years, according to the World Blundell Prism, housed in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum. His successor Alalengar ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues through 6 more rulers, each with reigns lasting between 18,600 and 43,200 years until it reaches the flood. Then the numbers change. The post-flood kings have reign lengths of decades, maybe a few centuries. Something about that earlier period was different. The text marks it as categorically distinct. This isn't careless mythology. The scribes who compiled the king list were sophisticated administrators. They kept meticulous economic records. They tracked grain supplies, labour hours, tribute payments with decimal precision. When they recorded impossibly long reigns for the antediluvian period, they weren't being sloppy. They were attempting to preserve information about an era they understood as operating under different conditions than their own. What conditions? The texts never explain. They simply mark that time as other, as before, as the period when things that would later require humans were accomplished by those who came first. Every major Sumerian city claimed foundation by divine action before human involvement. Eridu, Sippar, Larak, Shuruppak, these places appear in the texts as already present when humanity enters the story. Archaeological excavations confirm the extraordinary age of these sites. Eridu's lowest layers date to approximately 5400 B, making it among the oldest urban settlements ever discovered. The temples at Eridu show 18 distinct building phases, each constructed directly atop the ruins of the previous one, suggesting continuous sacred function at that location for millennia. Something drew repeated construction to that spot long before Sumerian civilization, as we know it, flourished. The cuneiform tablets don't describe these cities being built, they describe them being given, handed over, transferred, assigned to human management after some prior administration. The language used is administrative, the terminology borrowed from property transfer and custody agreements. Cities and their sacred rights were bestowed on humanity by divine decree. The underlying assumption in this phrasing is that someone else had them first. Who were the Anunnaki? The term appears in text after text, sometimes referring to the great gods collectively, sometimes to a specific group of deities assigned earthly duties while other gods remained in heaven. The name itself is disputed. It may mean princely offspring or those who from heaven to earth came. What isn't disputed is their centrality in these creation accounts. They are presented as the beings who did the work, who inhabited the cities, who managed the earth's systems before humanity took over those responsibilities. These texts never call them aliens, never suggest they came from another world, but they do consistently present them as other than human, as present on earth before humans, as capable of creating humans through deliberate effort. The Sumerians don't explain where the Anunnaki came from any more than they explain where matter itself came from. Both are treated as givens, as the initial conditions from which the story proceeds. Which raises the central question, the one that CBS 10673 and hundreds of tablets like it force us to confront. If we read these as symbolic mythology, we explain away the problem. Gods represent natural forces, creation is metaphor, the whole apparatus is theological poetry. Neat. Solved. But if we entertain even briefly the possibility that these texts are attempting to preserve actual information, not literal reporting, but cultural memory of something real transmitted across generations, then what are we looking at? A world before us, activities before us, civilizations, or at least civilization-like organization before us, and we, humanity, arriving not as the point of it all, but as a solution to a problem, as the next phase of something that was already underway. The clay in your hand would feel cool, smooth where the scribe's palm held it, rough where the stylus bit deep. In the controlled environment of the Penn Museum's vault, temperature and humidity remain constant, slowing the inevitable decay. But the information pressed into that clay 4 millennia ago outlasts empires. It sits there in the darkness, patient, waiting for anyone willing to read what it actually says, rather than what we assume it must mean. Before humans walked this earth, according to these Sumerians who left us their oldest words, the earth was not empty, it was not waiting, it was occupied. And what occurred during that occupation determined what would happen after we arrived, when heaven touched earth. The southern Iraqi desert stretches flat and pale beneath a sky that offers no shade. Heat distorts the horizon into liquid shimmer. For most of the year, nothing grows here except scrub that seems to survive on dust alone. Beneath this unpromising landscape lie the remains of what may be humanity's first civilization. The Sumerians left no pyramids, no Stonehenge, nothing that breaks the flat line of the earth enough to announce itself across centuries. They left mounds, low eroded hillocks that could be natural features or ancient trash heaps. Distinguishing between them requires trained eyes and considerable optimism. In 1889, the University of Pennsylvania funded an expedition to a mound called Nufar by local Bedouin tribes. Ancient sources suggested this was Nippur, one of Sumer's most important religious centres. The archaeologists who arrived found a wasteland. Temperatures reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Water had to be hauled in daily. The local population viewed the excavators with suspicion. Foreigners digging up dirt made no sense, and the rumour that they sought gold only complicated negotiations for labour and access. The expedition director, John Punnett Peters, was a professor of Hebrew at the University of Pennsylvania, not an archaeologist by training. The field was still inventing itself. Techniques that would later become standard, stratigraphic excavation, careful recording of find locations, preservation protocols, had not yet been established. The Nippur expedition operated more like mining than archaeology. Teams of local workers dug trenches and hauled dirt. Anything that looked interesting got set aside. The rest was discarded. What they found almost immediately were tablets. thousands of them, rooms full of tablets, whole libraries baked hard by ancient fires, preserved through accident rather than intention. The clay had been the Sumerians' paper, cheap, abundant, perfect for pressing symbols into while wet, then setting in the sun or baking in a kiln for permanent records. When Nippur burned, whether from invasion or accident or both, the tablets that might otherwise have dissolved in rain became ceramic, harder than pottery, practically indestructible. But they were also unreadable. The script covering them consisted of wedge-shaped marks pressed at various angles into the clay, cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge. These weren't the first cuneiform tablets discovered. Mesopotamian sites had been producing inscribed objects since the 1840s, but cuneiform represented multiple languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and the decipherment process was still underway. You could recognise the script without being able to read it, like finding a book in a language you've never encountered. The breakthrough in reading cuneiform came through the Behistun inscription, a massive text carved into a cliff face in Persia by order of Darius I around 520 BCE. The inscription repeated the same message in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Scholars could read Old Persian, which gave them a key to the other 2. By working backwards from known words and names, they gradually assembled vocabularies and grammars. By the 1880s, when Nippur was being excavated, Akkadian and Babylonian could be read with reasonable confidence. Sumerian was harder. It was older than the other languages, and it wasn't related to them. Akkadian and Babylonian are Semitic languages, part of the same family as Hebrew and Arabic. Sumerian appears to have no linguistic relatives at all. It's an isolate, a language that doesn't fit into any known family tree. This made decipherment difficult because you couldn't use comparative linguistics to fill in gaps. Every word, every grammatical structure had to be figured out from context and from bilingual tablets where Sumerian and Akkadian appeared side by side. The tablets from Nippur included many such bilingual texts. Sumerian had been a dead language for over 1,000 years when Nippur's libraries were destroyed, but it remained the language of scholarship and religion, like Latin in medieval Europe. Scribes learned Sumerian the way students today learn ancient Greek, through study texts and dictionaries. Those study texts, preserved in the ruins, gave modern scholars their Rosetta Stone for Sumerian. Hermann Hilprecht, a German-born Assyriologist working with the Pennsylvania expedition, spent decades studying the Nippur tablets. His wife Sally worked alongside him, copying inscriptions and managing the finds. The volume of material was staggering. By the time the Nippur expeditions concluded in 1900, they had shipped over 30,000 tablets and fragments back to Philadelphia. Hilprecht estimated that only represented a fraction of what remained buried. Among those thousands of fragments was CBS 10673. Its excavation date isn't precisely recorded in the expedition logs. Record keeping in those early years was inconsistent. What is recorded is its content, which Hilprecht recognised as significant. The tablet preserves what appears to be the oldest surviving creation narrative in Sumerian, later dubbed the Eridu Genesis after the city mentioned at its beginning. Only about 1/3 of the original tablet survives. The rest was either lost before discovery or crumbled during the excavation and transport. What remains tells a story that doesn't quite match what scholars expected creation myths to contain. The text is fragmentary, which makes continuous reading impossible, but the sections that survive are clear enough. At some point early in the composition, the very beginning is lost. The text describes a world where cities already exist. The Sumerian phrase is Urunam Lugala, which translates approximately as the city where kingship is. The verb tense suggests the state of already being, not the act of becoming. Later, after describing divine functions and sacred rites, the text introduces humanity with a brief passage. Mankind was given breath. The phrasing is passive. Humanity doesn't appear through natural generation or cosmic birth. Humanity is given, granted, bestowed. The verb form indicates an action performed by someone upon something else, and this action occurs after the description of cities and their functions, not before. The flood comes late in the surviving text. The hero Ziusudra appears as king of Shurpak, one of the cities mentioned earlier. He survives the deluge by building a boat on divine instruction. After 7 days and 7 nights, the flood ends. Ziusudra offers sacrifice. The gods grant him immortality and settle him in Dilmun, a paradisiacal land. The text ends there, or at least the surviving portion does. This narrative structure, cities, rituals, humanity, flood, hero, became recognizable as scholars translated more tablets. The pattern repeated across multiple compositions, with variations in detail but consistency in sequence. Always there is a before time when the world operates without humans. Always humanity is created deliberately for specific purposes. Always the flood separates that ancient period from the historical period. The Sumerians were telling the same story in different forms, which suggests they considered it important enough to preserve in multiple versions. Another tablet from Nippur, later catalogued as CBS 8383 and known as the Barton cylinder, provides additional context. This cylinder predates the Eridu Genesis by several centuries, written during the early dynastic period around 2500 BCE. It's not a creation myth in the same sense. It's a hymn, a poetic composition praising the city of Ke and its goddess. But embedded in the hymn is cosmological information that clarifies what the Sumerians believed about beginnings. The Barton cylinder describes a time before cities when Enlil, the air god, separated an... This separation is presented as the first necessary act of organization, the moment when undifferentiated cosmic matter became structured space. Once heaven and earth were separated, specific locations on earth became sacred, marked out for divine attention. Ke was one such location. The text describes the goddess Nintud founding the city and establishing its rights, but the language suggests that the physical space of Ke had significance even before the city was built, that the goddess recognized something already present at that location and chose to place her city there. This detail appears in other texts as well. Eridu is consistently described as the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, but the reason Eridu holds this status is never explained. The texts assume the reader knows, or they treat it as self-evident. Eridu sits at the edge of what was then marshland, near the meeting point of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers as they approach the Persian Gulf. Today the coastline has shifted and the rivers have changed course, but in the 5th millennium BCE, Eridu's location gave it access to both fresh water and the sea. Was that geographical advantage enough to make it sacred, or did something else draw the first settlement to that spot? Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted primarily in the 1940s by Iraqi archaeologist Fouad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, revealed a remarkable sequence. The site's lowest levels contained a small shrine, barely 2 meters across, with an offering table and evidence of ritual use. This shrine was rebuilt on the same spot 17 more times over thousands of years, each new temple constructed directly atop the ruins of the previous one. The architectural style remained consistent, a central room with an offering table, an altar, and a niche in the wall. The temples grew larger over time, but the basic plan stayed the same. The oldest temple at Eridu dates to approximately 5400 BCE during the Ubaid period. This predates Sumerian civilization as such. The Ubaid people left no writing, so we don't know what language they spoke or what they called themselves, but they built temples, practiced irrigation agriculture, and established permanent settlements. When Sumerian culture emerged around 4500 BC, it didn't replace the Ubaid culture so much as continue it. The same locations remained sacred. The same temple plans remained in use. The transition was cultural and linguistic, not a complete population replacement. This archaeological continuity raises questions about the Sumerian texts that describe Eridu's divine foundation. If the Sumerians inherited Eridu from an earlier people, did they also inherit traditions about its origin? Were the stories of gods founding the city passed down from the Ubaid period, translated into Sumerian when the language changed? If so, how much older might these traditions be than the texts that preserve them? The same question applies to other Sumerian cities. Uruk, which became the largest city in the world by 3100 BC, shows continuous occupation from the Ubaid period forward. Lagash, Kish, all of them have deep archaeological layers predating Sumerian writing. These cities were old when the Sumerians first wrote about them. The urban landscape of southern Mesopotamia was inherited, not created, by the civilization that left us written records. Understanding this changes how we read the texts. When the Sumerian king list states that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, it's not claiming that Eridu suddenly appeared at that moment. The city was already there. What descended was kingship, a specific form of political organisation, perhaps, or the divine mandate to rule. The text distinguishes between the physical existence of cities and the establishment of a particular kind of authority within them. Similarly, when Eridugenesis describes cities where divine functions are already being performed, it may be reflecting actual Sumerian experience. They lived in cities they hadn't built. They maintained temples on foundations laid by people they couldn't name. Their entire civilization rested on infrastructure they had inherited. The texts that place gods as the city founders may be acknowledging that debt, an admission that the Sumerians themselves were not the original builders, that someone or something else had established the urban framework they occupied. This doesn't require believing gods literally built cities. It suggests the Sumerians were honest about the limits of their knowledge. They didn't claim to have invented urban life. They located its origins in a time before their records began, a time they could only describe in the language available to them, the language of divine action and cosmic ordering. The cuneiform tablets record what they record. Modern interpretation adds the framework. We call it mythology because it involves gods. The Sumerians called it history because it explained their present. Both perspectives can be partially right. The tablets preserve memory of being the inheritors rather than the originators, memory of a landscape already shaped when their ancestors arrived, memory encoded in story because story is what survives when precise details fade. Nippur's ruined libraries held these memories in clay. The tablets survived because clay is patient. It doesn't decay if kept dry. It doesn't burn, it hardens. What the Sumerians pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus would outlast their cities, their language, their civilization entire. And what they chose to preserve, what they copied generation after generation in scribal schools and temple archives, was this story of before, of cities that existed before kingship, of order that existed before humanity, of a world already functioning when we arrived to take our place within it. That world, as described in the texts being shipped back to Philadelphia in crates, was not empty, it was busy. And what kept it busy is what the tablets reveal next, not in metaphor, but in detailed procedural language describing work, burden, complaint, and eventually solution. The world that was already there. The Sumerian phrase Udriyar translates roughly as in those days or in the days of old. It appears at the beginning of many ancient texts, a formulaic opening that signals narrative time, not the present, not the recent past, but the deep past, the time beyond memory when things were different. When that phrase opens a text, What follows is meant to be understood as very old information, passed down carefully, possibly for so long that its origin has been forgotten, but its content remains important enough to preserve. CBS 673, the Eridu Genesis tablet, uses this formula. After the opening lines establish Udra A, the text immediately begins describing cities, not their construction, their existence. The cities were named, the dividing lines were drawn. Perfect tense, already completed. The verb structure indicates a state of affairs that was true when the narrative begins, not an action happening within the narrative's time frame. 5 cities get named: Eridu, Batibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shuruppak. Each receives one line noting its name and its founding deity. Eridu belongs to Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom. Batibira belongs to Dumuzi, the shepherd god. Larak belongs to Pabilsag, a warrior deity. Sipar belongs to Utu, the sun god. Shuruppak belongs to Sud, later identified with the goddess Ninlil. The text provides this information as catalogue, not narrative, a list establishing what exists before the story proper begins. Then come the ordinances. The Sumerian term is mi, pronounced may, which doesn't translate cleanly into English. The mi are divine decrees, cosmic laws, the fundamental principles that allow civilization to function. They include things like kingship, priesthood, writing, metalworking, judgment, but also abstract concepts like truth, descent into the underworld, and ascent from the underworld. The mi are treated as tangible things that can be possessed, transferred, or stolen. Several Sumerian myths revolve around the transfer of mi from one deity to another, as if civilization's blueprints were physical objects to be guarded or claimed. In the Eridu Genesis, the mi are not being invented or created, they are being administered, put into effect, organized. The text describes this as if reporting on institutional activity, the equivalent of procedures were implemented, guidelines were established. The passive voice dominates. Someone is doing this work, but the text's focus is on the work itself, not the workers. Only after cities are named and ordinances are established does humanity appear. The exact line is difficult to translate because of damage to the tablet, but the surviving words include mankind, the verb to give or to grant, and possibly breath or life. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish Assyriologist who published the definitive translation of Eridu Genesis in 1981, rendered it, mankind was given breath. The syntax suggests an action performed by an unspecified subject upon a direct object. Humanity is the object. The gods, presumably, are the subject, though the text doesn't explicitly say so here. What follows humanity's creation is another passive construction. Kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerian Nam Lugalantaredde is more literally the office of king from heaven came down. Not a person descending, but an office, a function, a role. And it comes from heaven, not from within the earth, or from among humans themselves. The text presents kingship as an import, something brought in from outside the human sphere. This sequence, cities exist, ordinances function, humanity is created, kingship descends, establishes a clear chronology. The tablets position humanity's creation not at the beginning, but partway through. Before humans arrived, the cities were already functioning under some other arrangement. The text never explains what that arrangement was. It moves directly from naming the cities to describing their ordinances to noting that mankind was given breath, as if the intermediate information is either understood by the audience or considered unnecessary to state. But other tablets fill in that gap. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on multiple tablets now scattered across several museum collections, provides the missing context. 3 main tablets of Atrahasis survive, the most complete being BM 78941 in the British Museum, excavated from Sipar in the 19th century. The epic's name comes from its hero Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise, who survives the flood through divine warning, the same roles Yasudra plays in Eridu Genesis and Utnapishtim plays in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But the flood comes late in Atrahasis. The epic's first third concerns what happened before humanity existed, and it is strangely specific about the details. The opening of Atrahasis describes divine labour distribution. The great gods, Anu, Enlil and Enki, cast lots to determine who controls which domain. Anu gets the sky, Enlil gets the earth, Enki gets the waters beneath the earth, the Abzu. This division of authority is presented as an administrative act, not a cosmic creation. The domains already exist. The gods are assigning management responsibility. Under Enlil's earthly administration are the Igigi, a class of deities described as lesser gods or junior gods. The text assigns them physical labour. They must dig irrigation canals. They must dredge rivers. They must maintain the waterworks that allow agriculture to function. The language used to describe this work is technical, the names of tools, the specific tasks involved in canal construction, the organisation of labour crews. This is not metaphorical. The epic is describing ditch digging, and the Igigi hate it. The text devotes dozens of lines to their complaints. The work is hard. The work is endless. They toil day and night for 40 years. The epic gives a specific time frame until they can bear it no longer. Their rebellion begins with a work stoppage. They burn their tools. They gather outside Enlil's house in the middle of the night. They shout demands. Enlil, woken by the commotion, is alarmed. The text describes his confusion. Who has declared war? Who has raised weapons against me? He doesn't immediately understand that this is a labour dispute. He interprets it as insurrection, a challenge to his authority. Anu and Enki are summoned. A divine council convenes to address the crisis. The Igigi's spokesman explains their position. The work is beyond their capacity to endure. They cannot continue. Something must change, or they will not return to their labour. Enlil is furious and considers crushing the rebellion by force, but Enki proposes an alternative. Create beings specifically designed to bear the burden. Fashion workers who can take over the tasks the Igigi refuse to perform. Make humanity. The goddess Nintu, also called Mummy or Belet Ili, depending on the text, is called upon to perform the creation. She is the womb goddess, the deity whose domain includes birth and generation. The procedure is described in procedural detail. The god Geshtu-E, identified as one of the rebels, or possibly a god with intelligence, is slaughtered. His blood is mixed with clay. Nintu shapes the mixture into human forms. The text specifies 14 pieces, 7 male and 7 female. The birth goddesses, acting as midwives, carry these forms for 9 months. Then humanity is born. The purpose is explicit. The new creatures will bear the yoke that the gods refuse to carry. The Sumerian term dullu, usually translated as work or toil or corv labour, appears repeatedly. Humanity exists to perform dullu. The gods, relieved of this burden, celebrate. The Igigi return to heaven. Enlil's administration continues, now with a purpose-built workforce managing the Earth's physical systems. Atrahasis then follows human history through several episodes where the human population grows too large and too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. Enlil attempts several culling events, plague, drought, famine, before finally deciding on a flood to wipe out humanity entirely. Enki, who sympathises with his creations, warns Atrahasis to build a boat. The flood comes. Atrahasis survives. The gods, having nearly destroyed their workforce, realise they need humanity to continue functioning, so they permit the survivors to reproduce, but they implement population controls to prevent future overcrowding. The epic ends with a compromise. Humans will continue to exist and work, but their numbers will be limited, their lifespans shortened, and certain women will be barren to maintain population levels the gods find tolerable. Humanity's role is secured, but within constraints designed to prevent the problems that led to the flood. Reading Atrahasis alongside Eridu Genesis clarifies the chronology. Before humanity, the gods themselves performed the labour necessary to maintain Earth's systems. That arrangement proved unsustainable. The crisis forced a solution: the creation of a species capable of doing the work the gods no longer wished to do. Humanity enters the story as the answer to a divine labour problem. This is a strange creation myth. It grants humans no special cosmic significance. It doesn't suggest we are the crown of creation, or the beloved children of benevolent deities, or the purpose for which the universe exists. It describes us as tools, sophisticated, capable tools, but tools nonetheless. We exist because the gods needed help with the irrigation canals. If this is metaphor, what does it metaphorize? Some scholars suggest it reflects the Sumerian experience of corv labour, mandatory work service owed to temple and palace. In this reading, the myth justifies social hierarchy by projecting it onto the cosmic plane. Just as humans must labour for the gods, so lower classes must labour for the upper classes. The story naturalises inequality by making it part of creation's design. That interpretation is plausible. Ancient myths often serve social functions, legitimising existing power structures by claiming divine origins for them. But it doesn't explain why the text spends so much time describing the pre-human period. If the point is to justify human labour, why include the extended passage about divine labour disputes? Why not simply say the gods created humans to work and move on? The detail suggests memory, not metaphor. The Agige's specific complaints, the 40-year time frame, the technical vocabulary of canal construction, the procedural description of humanity's creation, these elements read more like preserved information than invented symbolism. Either the text is remarkably committed to its metaphorical frame, or it is attempting to pass down specifics about something that actually happened, as understood by the people who first told this story. Another text, catalogued as ETCSL 1.1, 2 and titled Enki and Ninmah in modern editions, provides a third account of humanity's creation, with different details but the same basic structure. In this version, the mother goddess Namu notices that the gods are struggling with their work and suggests to her son Enki that he create helpers. Enki agrees and instructs Namu on the procedure. She shapes humans from clay taken from above the Abzu, the freshwater realm Enki controls. But Enki and Ninmah then engage in a strange contest. Enki challenges Ninmah to decree the fate of whatever he creates. He fashions 6 beings with severe impairments, unable to urinate, unable to speak, barren, sexless, weak. Ninmah assigns each a place in society where their impairment becomes useful. The barren woman becomes a weaver. The sexless person becomes a palace attendant. The text presents this as evidence of Ninmah's wisdom, her ability to find purpose even for beings who seem defective. Then Ninmah takes a turn. She creates a being so damaged it cannot function at all, called Umul in the text, a creature that cannot eat, cannot speak, cannot sit, cannot stand. Enki tries to assign it a fate but cannot. He admits defeat. Ninmah has created something so broken that even divine wisdom cannot find a use for it. This disturbing episode serves no obvious mythological purpose. It doesn't explain any natural phenomenon or justify any social practice. It reads like experimental record keeping, as if documenting attempts to create beings capable of specific functions, with many failures before success. The contest between Enki and Ninmah resembles the trial and error process of design, not the theological certainty of divine creation mythology. When these 3 accounts, Eridugenesis, Atrahasis, and Enki and Ninmah, are read together, a consistent picture emerges. Before humanity, the earth required maintenance labour. Divine beings performed that labour until they could no longer sustain it. A crisis forced innovation. Beings were fashioned through deliberate process to take over specific functions. Multiple attempts were required. Early versions had flaws. Eventually a successful design was implemented. The new beings proved capable of performing the required work, and the system stabilized with humans as the permanent labor force. This is not how creation myths typically work. Most traditions present humanity as the climax of creation, the reason for divine effort. The Mesopotamian texts present us as a pragmatic solution to a management problem. We appear late in the sequence, after cities are established and systems are already functioning. Our purpose is defined by the needs of those who created us, not by our own inherent value. The question this raises is not whether gods literally shaped humans from clay. The question is what cultural memory these texts preserve. Why would the Sumerians, across multiple independent compositions spanning centuries, consistently describe themselves as latecomers to an already occupied Earth? What were they trying to remember? The texts describe that pre-human Earth in functional terms, not a paradise, not a void, but a working system requiring constant attention. Cities existed, ordinances were established, labour was organised, and then, when the original labourers could no longer continue, humanity was introduced to take their place. If we take the texts seriously as attempts to preserve information, not as literal reporting, but as the best available framework for passing down something real, then they suggest a profound possibility. The Earth humans inherited was not pristine wilderness waiting to be shaped. It was already shaped. The infrastructure was already in place. We stepped into a role that had been occupied before we existed, and the texts that describe this stepping in are careful to note that we were shaped specifically for that role, designed to fit the requirements of work that predated our arrival. The tablets record this. They have recorded it for 4,000 years, and they will continue recording it in cuneiform wedges pressed into clay, patient and permanent, long after the debates about their meaning have faded into the same deep time they describe. Before the first breath. The British Museum tablet, catalogued as BM 78941, is damaged along its right edge. About 1/3 of each line is missing, which makes translation difficult in places, but enough survives to follow the narrative. The tablet is written in Akkadian, the language that succeeded Sumerian as the dominant tongue of Mesopotamia around 2000 BC, though the story it tells is far older. Multiple copies of this text exist, suggesting it was important enough to be recopied across generations. The version in the British Museum dates to approximately 1635 B, during the reign of King Ammisaduqa of Babylon. It was excavated from Sippar, one of the cities the text itself names as existing before humanity. The story opens before creation. Not cosmic creation, the universe already exists. Earth already exists. Heaven already exists. The Abzu, the fresh water ocean beneath the earth, already exists. What hasn't yet been created is humanity. The text describes a world that is physically complete but functionally stressed. The gods have a problem. The problem is work, specifically the maintenance of irrigation systems across Mesopotamia. The text is explicit about this. The gods must dig the canals, must dredge the rivers, must open up the watercourses. The Akkadian vocabulary is technical, the terminology borrowed from actual canal construction. This is not abstract cosmic labour, this is hydraulic engineering described in procedural detail. The gods assigned to this work are called the Igigi. The term's etymology is unclear, but it refers to a class of younger deities distinct from the great gods who sit in the divine council. The Igigi are subordinate, tasked with carrying out the decisions made by Anu, Enlil, and Enki, the triad who control heaven, earth, and the underworld waters, respectively. The text establishes this hierarchy clearly. The great gods give orders. The Igigi perform the orders. The arrangement is administrative, not familial. For 40 years, according to the text's specific time frame, the Igigi carry out their assigned labour. They dig, they dredge, they haul earth. The work is described as too heavy, the burden too much. The repetition of these phrases across multiple lines creates a sense of mounting exhaustion. The Igigi's complaints grow more frequent as the passage continues. They speak of day and night, of endless toil, of work that never allows rest. Then something shifts. The text describes the Igigi gathering in secret, planning their response to unsustainable conditions. The vocabulary used here is political, words associated with rebellion, conspiracy, organised resistance. The Igigi are not simply stopping work. They are making a collective decision to refuse continued labour, understanding that their refusal will force the great gods to acknowledge the situation. At night, they march to Enlil's dwelling. The text emphasises the nighttime setting. This is a confrontation designed to catch the chief administrator off guard, to create a crisis that demands immediate response. They surround his house. They burn their tools. The smoke and noise wake Enlil, who doesn't initially understand what's happening. His servant Nusku comes to him and explains, "My lord, the gods have surrounded your dwelling." Enlil's reaction is interesting. His first interpretation is military. He asks Nusku, has war been declared? He assumes attack, not protest. He doesn't immediately grasp that his own workforce is rebelling against him. This detail humanises the narrative. Enlil's confusion reads as the confusion of authority confronted with organised labour resistance, unable to process that his subordinates are challenging the system rather than threatening him personally. Nusku investigates and reports back. The Igigi have assembled. They have set fire to their tools. The work is too hard for them. Enlil is both alarmed and offended. The text describes him weeping, not from sorrow, but from anger and perhaps fear. His administrative system is collapsing. Without the Igigi's labour, Earth's irrigation systems will fail. Crops will die. The entire structure of divine civilization depends on those waterworks functioning. Enlil summons the divine council. Anu descends from heaven. Enki emerges from the Abzu. The great gods convene in emergency session to address the crisis. Enlil wants the rebellion's leader identified and punished. Who instigated this? Who stirred up warfare? He's still framing the situation as insubordination to be crushed, rather than a legitimate complaint to be resolved. But the Igigi have a spokesman, and when he speaks, he doesn't back down. The text gives him several lines of direct speech, a rare thing in Akkadian narrative where most dialogue is brief and functional. He says, "The work is too heavy, the toil kills us. Too much is our distress." He notes that every god, collectively, has been complaining. This isn't one malcontent. It's universal dissatisfaction with an unsustainable system. Enki, watching this exchange, seems to understand something Enlil hasn't grasped. The Igigi aren't rejecting divine authority, they're rejecting impossible work conditions. The distinction matters. If the work itself is the problem, changing management won't solve anything. You need to change the work arrangement itself. Enki proposes exactly that. Create new beings capable of bearing the burden the Igigi cannot sustain. Belet Ili, the womb goddess, is present, Enki says. Let her create mankind. Let them bear the yoke of the gods. The phrasing is direct. Bear the yoke is not metaphorical in Akkadian. It's the literal term for an ox wearing a harness, pulling a plough or cart. The new beings will be beasts of burden, purpose-built for labour. The gods refuse to continue performing. Belet Ili agrees, but she sets a condition. It is not mine to do these things, she says. This work is Enki's. He purifies everything. Let him give me the clay, and I will do the work. She's establishing responsibility. She will physically create the beings, but the design specifications and raw materials must come from Enki. If humans prove defective, the fault lies with him, not her. Enki accepts this. He instructs the gods to slaughter one of their own. The text names Geshtu-i, a god who has intelligence. The phrasing suggests Geshtu-i has understanding, rationality, the capacity for thought. His slaughter serves a specific purpose. His blood, containing his intelligence, will be mixed with clay to give the new beings the cognitive capacity needed to perform complex work. Pure clay would create mindless automatons. Clay mixed with divine blood creates beings capable of learning, planning, following instructions, capable, in other words, of maintaining irrigation systems without constant divine supervision. The procedure is described step by step. Geshtui is killed at the Assembly of Gods, a public execution witnessed by the Divine Council. His blood is collected. Belet Eli mixes it with clay. The mixture is divided into 14 pieces, 7 male and 7 female. These are not fully formed humans yet. They require gestation. The text brings in other goddesses, birth goddesses, who are assigned to carry the forming beings for 10 months, 9 months in some versions, but BM 78941 specifies 10. During this gestation period, Enki prescribes additional procedures. Certain rituals must be performed. Certain substances must be prepared. The birth goddesses must recite specific incantations. The detail is obsessive, as if recording protocols that must be followed exactly to achieve the desired result. This doesn't read like theological poetry, it reads like laboratory notes. When the time comes, the birth goddesses gather. They squat in formation, 4 on each side, 6 total. The text provides spatial arrangements. Bela Ili sits in the centre. The beings are born. The text says mankind came into being. The verb construction indicates successful completion of a designed process, not spontaneous generation or divine fiat. The response from the gathered gods is relief verging on jubilation. You have created mankind. The hard work of the gods is finished. They celebrate because the labour crisis is resolved. Humanity exists now to dig the canals, to dredge the rivers, to maintain the systems. The text describes humans being immediately assigned to these tasks. There is no period of paradise, no garden, no time of idleness. Humans are born and put to work. That is their purpose. But the story doesn't end with creation's success. Atrahasis continues for several hundred more lines, tracking humanity's subsequent history. The new workforce proves so successful that the human population explodes. Within 1200 years, the text provides specific chronology. Humans have filled the earth. Their numbers produce a new problem, noise. The Akkadian term is rigmu, which means uproar, clamour, tumult. Humanity is loud. The gods, especially Enlil, cannot sleep. The text emphasises this repeatedly. Mankind's clamour disturbed Enlil. He could not rest because of the uproar. The noise becomes unbearable. Enlil decides humans must be reduced. He sends plague. A significant portion of humanity dies, but the survivors reproduce, and within another 1200 years, the population returns to previous levels. The noise resumes. Enlil tries drought. Again, massive die-off, but again recovery and return to unsustainable population. Enlil tries famine. Same result. Humans keep bouncing back. Frustrated, Enlil proposes total annihilation. He will send a flood, a deluge so complete that no human survives. The species will be erased, and the gods will have to find some other solution to their labour problem, or accept that they must return to doing the work themselves. The other gods agree to this plan. The decision is made. Humanity's extinction is scheduled, but Enki dissents. He has sympathy for his creations, not sentimental attachment, but pragmatic concern. If humans are wiped out, the gods return to their previous unsustainable situation. Better to preserve humanity, but implement controls to prevent overpopulation. Enki cannot openly defy the Divine Council's decision, so he acts through subterfuge. He goes to the house of Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise human mentioned in the text title. Atrahasis is likely a king or priest, someone important enough that his survival will allow humanity's continuation. Enki speaks to Atrahasis through the wall of a reed hut. The text specifies this detail, perhaps to technically avoid directly addressing a human, which might violate the council's decree. He warns of the coming flood. He gives detailed instructions for boat construction, including measurements, materials, and waterproofing methods. Atrahasis follows the instructions. He builds the boat. He loads it with animals, his family, provisions. The flood comes. It lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The text describes the storm's violence in vivid language, winds that tear apart houses, water that rises above mountains, darkness so complete that brothers could not see each other. The gods themselves are terrified. They retreat to the highest heaven. They huddle like dogs against the outer wall, frightened by the destruction they've unleashed. Belet-Ili weeps, regretting that she agreed to Enlil's plan. The other goddesses wail with her. Even Enlil begins to understand that the flood's magnitude exceeds what he intended. The text describes the gods as shocked by their own capacity for destruction. When the flood subsides, Atra-Hassis's boat grounds on a mountain. He opens the hatch, sees sunlight, falls to his knees. He offers sacrifice. The smell of burning offerings rises. The gods, who haven't eaten in 7 days, the text notes this detail, gather around the sacrifice like flies. They are starving. Without humanity to provide offerings, they have nothing to eat. This is the moment when the system's dependency becomes clear. The gods created humans to perform labour, yes, but also to provide food through sacrifice and ritual offerings. The relationship is transactional. Humans work the earth. Humans give portions of that work's fruit to the gods through temple offerings. The gods, in turn, maintain cosmic order and provide protection. Both sides need the other. Eliminating humanity means eliminating the gods' food supply. Enlil arrives at the sacrifice site and sees Atra-Hassis alive. He is furious. All of mankind was to perish. How did any living creature escape? Enki admits his intervention. Enlil is ready to punish him, but the other gods intervene. They point out that humanity's survival is actually necessary. The alternative, permanent flood or permanent labour by the gods themselves, is unacceptable. Better to keep humans alive but implement controls. Enki proposes the solution that closes the epic. Humanity will continue to exist, but changes will be implemented. Some women will be made barren. Certain demons will be authorized to kill infants. Human lifespans will be shortened. These measures will prevent runaway population growth while preserving enough humans to maintain the labour force. The gods agree. Atra-Hassis and his family become the foundation of post-flood humanity. The system rebalances. The final lines of Atra-Hassis return to the beginning. Humanity exists to bear the yoke. The gods are freed from hard labour. The arrangement continues, now with protections against the overpopulation that previously threatened it. The text ends there, as if saying, and this is why things are as they are. This is why humans work. Why we die young. Why some of us are barren. The system was designed this way deliberately. After trial and error, proved what did and didn't work. Reading Atra-Hassis is a strange experience. It provides exactly the information that Eridu Genesis leaves out, the detailed procedural account of what happened before humanity and why humanity was created. But it raises as many questions as it answers. If this is pure mythology, why is it so specific about canal work, irrigation techniques, labour organisation? If it's metaphor for social hierarchy, why include the flood narrative where even the gods are frightened and dependent on human offerings? If it's invented to justify kingship or priesthood, why portray the gods as so uncertain, so prone to missteps, so dependent on trial and error? The text reads less like justification and more like explanation, less like theology and more like history, not necessarily factual history, but history as the Mesopotamians understood it, the narrative framework through which they made sense of their place in the world. They saw themselves as workers maintaining systems they didn't create. They lived in cities they hadn't founded. They practiced rites whose origins predated their civilization. The story of divine labour crisis and human creation as solution makes sense of that experience. It explains why civilization feels inherited rather than invented. And it places humanity's origin not at the beginning of the story, but in the middle. Before us, the earth was not empty. It was occupied. It was worked. it was organised. We arrived to continue that work when those who came before could not or would not continue. The tablets are clear about this sequence. Whether we interpret it as myth, memory, or metaphor, the sequence remains consistent across every version of the story. There was a world before humanity. That world required maintenance. We were designed specifically to maintain it. And the texts that record this design were important enough that scribes copied them for 2,000 years, preserving in cuneiform the account of how and why we came to be here. The cities of the gods. Tel Abu Sharain sits in southern Iraq, about 12 miles southwest of Nasiriyah. The mound rises barely 7 meters above the surrounding desert floor, low enough that from a distance it could be a natural hill rather than the compacted remains of millennia of human occupation. No visible architecture announces its significance. The mud brick that formed its buildings has eroded back into earth, leaving only the outline of foundations and the subtle elevation that marks where structures once stood. Archaeologists call this a tell, the Arabic word for mound, and throughout Mesopotamia these artificial hills mark where ancient cities slowly rose through cycles of construction, collapse, and rebuilding. Fuad Safar began excavating Tel Abu Sharain in 1946, working on behalf of the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities. Seton Lloyd, a British archaeologist, joined him for several seasons. Their work revealed what textual sources had long suggested. This mound was Eridu, the city's Sumerian tradition identified as the first place kingship descended from heaven, the sacred centre where civilization began. The excavations focused on the temple complex. The tell's highest point marked where a ziggurat had once stood, a massive stepped pyramid typical of Mesopotamian religious architecture. By the time Safar and Lloyd arrived, the ziggurat was a shapeless mound, its original form impossible to discern, but beneath it, in the deeper strata, lay the sequence of temples that preceded the ziggurat's construction. 18 distinct building phases, each temple built directly atop the ruins of the one before, each maintaining the same basic orientation and floor plan despite centuries separating their construction dates. The lowest temple, designated Temple 1 in the archaeological reports, measured only 12 feet square. It consisted of a single room with an offering table against one wall and a small altar or pedestal in the centre. The walls were mud brick. The floor was packed earth. Nothing about the structure was elaborate, yet its placement was deliberate. Someone chose this exact location, built this small shrine, and performed rituals here significant enough that future generations would rebuild on the same spot for the next 3,000 years. Carbon dating and ceramic analysis date Temple 1 to approximately 5400 BC during the Ubaid period. This predates writing by roughly 2,000 years. Whatever rituals occurred in that earlier shrine, no written records describe them. The people who built Temple 1 left no texts explaining their beliefs or naming their deities. All we have is the structure itself and the fact that it was important enough to mark this location as sacred for generations that followed. Temple 2, built atop the ruins of Temple 1, after some period of time archaeologists can only estimate, expanded the basic plan. It measured roughly 15 feet square, still small but noticeably larger than its predecessor. The same elements appeared, offering table, central altar, same orientation. Someone was maintaining tradition while allowing for growth. This pattern repeated through all 18 phases. Each temple grew larger. Each added architectural features, pilasters, buttresses, more elaborate altar arrangements. But the core layout remained constant. The offering table stayed in the same relative position. The altar stayed central. The building faced the same direction. By Temple the 7, dated to approximately 4500 BC, the structure measured 45 feet in length. It was no longer a simple shrine, but a substantial building with multiple rooms, a fade decorated with engaged columns, and niches designed to hold cult statues. This was recognisably Sumerian temple architecture, the same style that would characterise Mesopotamian religious buildings for the next 3 millennia. Yet it sat on foundations laid 1,000 years earlier by people who weren't Sumerian, who didn't speak Sumerian, whose identity remains unknown. This architectural continuity poses questions that archaeology struggles to answer definitively. The Ubaid culture transitioned into what scholars call the Uruk period around 4000 BCE. During this transition, Sumerian language and culture became dominant across southern Mesopotamia. But the transition wasn't a replacement. The same sites remained occupied, the same temples remained in use, the same sacred locations maintained their status. Eridu didn't become sacred to the Sumerians. It was already sacred when Sumerian civilization emerged, and the Sumerians inherited that sacredness. When Sumerian texts describe Eridu's foundation by Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, they aren't claiming the Sumerians built the city. They're acknowledging that Eridu's origins preceded them. Attributing foundation to a god is a way of saying the city's beginning lies beyond human memory. It was there before we can account for it, so divine action must explain it. The texts are surprisingly honest about this limitation. They don't invent a Sumerian founder king or claim a historical Sumerian established the site. They locate Eridu's beginning in divine action, specifically because its human beginning is unknown. The other cities named in Eridu Genesis and the Sumerian king list show similar patterns. Sippar, in northern Mesopotamia, has occupation layers extending back to the Ubaid period. Shuruppak, modern Tel Fara, shows continuous settlement from approximately 5000 BCE. Larak's precise location is uncertain. No site has been definitively identified as ancient Larak, but references in multiple texts suggest it too was among the oldest settlements. These cities weren't founded in historical time by kings whose names we know. They emerged during the Neolithic transition to permanent settlement established by people whose names are lost. Yet the texts treat these cities as special, not just old, but foundational. The Sumerian king list opens with the phrase, "After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." The phrasing is specific. Kingship descended. It came from somewhere else, from heaven, whatever that meant to the Sumerians, and it manifested first in Eridu. Not the city itself, but the institution of kingship. The city already existed. What arrived was a form of political organisation. This distinction appears consistently in Mesopotamian thought. Cities are physical places with foundations in earth. Kingship is an office, a me, one of those divine decrees that structure civilization. The me can move, the me can be transferred. Cities remain where they are, but the me that authorises power within them can shift from one location to another. The king list itself documents this movement. After Eridu, kingship moved to Badtabira, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. Each transfer is recorded as if describing capital cities in a political federation, authority moving from centre to centre according to some organisational logic the text doesn't explain. Before the flood, according to the king list, 5 cities held kingship in succession. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. The same phrase used for the original descent, but this time to Kish rather than Eridu. The post-flood sequence moves through Kish, Uruk, Ur, Awan, Hamazi, and continues through dozens of cities across 2 millennia of documented history. These later transfers can be verified. We know when Uruk's power waned and Urez rose. We have records, artifacts, treaties documenting the political shifts. But the pre-flood sequence can't be verified. Those 5 cities, Eridu, Badtabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, exist archaeologically, and they are genuinely ancient, but the political organisation the king list attributes to them predates writing. We have no contemporary records from that period. We have only the later Sumerian claim that these cities held kingship before the flood, and that the kings who ruled them lived impossibly long lives. The question becomes, what is the king list trying to preserve? If it's purely mythological, why attach it to real cities that archaeologists can excavate? Why not invent imaginary locations for the mythological period and reserve real cities for the historical record? The text instead grounds its pre-flood narrative in geography. The cities named are actual places the Sumerians knew, places whose ruins were already ancient when Sumerian civilization flourished. One possibility is that the Sumerians were doing their best to reconstruct a past they knew existed but couldn't fully recover. They lived in cities they hadn't founded. They practiced rites whose origins preceded their records. They knew, somehow, that their civilization rested on foundations laid by others. The king list's pre-flood section might represent their attempt to acknowledge that debt, to preserve even incomplete information about the time before their written records began. Another possibility, less comfortable for conventional interpretation, is that the text preserved transmitted knowledge. Not written knowledge, writing didn't exist yet, but oral tradition passed down carefully across generations. Stories about a time when these cities functioned under different administration. Stories that survived the flood and the cultural disruption it caused. Stories that later Sumerians wrote down because they believed them to be true, or at least believed they contained truth worth preserving. Archaeological evidence offers tantalizing hints without definitive answers. Eridu's temple sequence demonstrates continuous sacred function for 3 millennia, but it doesn't tell us why that location was chosen initially. Excavations have revealed residential areas around the temple complex, evidence of a substantial population by 4000 BC. The houses were well built, with courtyards and multiple rooms. Trash pits contained fish bones and shells. Eridu sat near marshlands rich in aquatic resources. There were storage facilities for grain, workshops for craft production, and graves containing burial goods, suggesting social differentiation. This was a functioning city, not just a religious site. People lived there, worked there, raised families there, and they did so on ground that had been sacred for over 1,000 years before Sumerian civilization emerged. Whatever happened at Eridu during those pre-Sumerian millennia established something important enough that all subsequent occupation respected it. The temples kept rebuilding in the same location. The city's status remained secure. When the Sumerians wrote their histories, Eridu stood first. Enki's association with Eridu is consistent across all texts that mention the city. He is its patron deity, its protector, its divine inhabitant. His temple there was called Iengura, House of the Subterranean Waters, acknowledging the freshwater springs that fed the marshlands around Eridu. The Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth, was considered Enki's domain, and Eridu's location near where the Euphrates met the Gulf gave it symbolic connection to that realm. Enki's character in Mesopotamian mythology is complex. He is a creator god, but also a trickster, willing to deceive other deities to protect his creations. He is wise, credited with establishing the me that governs civilization, yet he gives those me away to Inanna in a drinking contest. He is associated with water, but also with semen, with generation and fertility, with the life-giving properties of liquid. In the creation narratives, he designs humanity. In the flood narratives, he saves humanity. He is consistently portrayed as humanity's benefactor, the god most willing to intervene on our behalf against cosmic forces indifferent to our survival. If Eridu was Enki's city before it was humanity's city, if the texts mean that literally, not metaphorically, then what was happening there during the time the texts describe as before humans? The Atrahasis epic states that Enki controlled the Abzu, the subterranean waters, and that his domain required maintenance. Canals had to be dug, watercourses had to be managed. The implication is that Eridu functioned as an administrative centre for hydraulic engineering on a massive scale, managing the water systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible. Southern Mesopotamia is flat, with minimal elevation change across hundreds of miles. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flood unpredictably, sometimes bringing too much water, sometimes too little. Natural rainfall is insufficient for reliable agriculture. Everything depends on irrigation, bringing river water to fields through controlled channels, storing excess water in basins, draining waterlogged areas. This requires planning, coordination, maintenance, and constant vigilance. A system sophisticated enough to support cities requires centralized management. The Sumerians inherited that system. When writing emerges around 3200 BC, the earliest texts are administrative records tracking water distribution, field assignments, crop yields. The system is already functioning. The texts don't describe inventing irrigation. They describe managing existing infrastructure. Someone built that infrastructure before writing documented its construction. Someone organised the labour. Someone maintained the knowledge of how the system worked. The Ubaid people, presumably. The archaeological culture that preceded Sumerian civilization. But the Ubaid left no texts, so we don't know how they organised themselves or whether they had centralised authority capable of managing regional irrigation networks. We only know they established permanent settlements and practiced agriculture. The sophistication of water management appears in the archaeological record fully formed during the Uruk period when Sumerian culture emerged. But the locations of the earliest cities suggest they were positioned to control water resources, which implies planning precedes visible infrastructure. Eridu sits at the southern limit of possible agriculture in Mesopotamia. Further south lies the Gulf. To the north, the land gradually rises toward the river valleys. Eridu's location isn't agriculturally optimal. The land is marshy, difficult to drain, but it's strategically perfect for controlling water flowing south. Whoever held Eridu controlled the lower Euphrates. Whoever managed Eridu's hydraulics could influence irrigation for hundreds of miles upstream. If the texts preserve memory of a time when divine administrators, whether that means something literal or refers to a now forgotten priesthood or ruling class, managed these systems from Eridu, then the city's sacred status makes practical sense. Sacred not because arbitrary religious sentiment designated it so, but because the knowledge and authority located there were essential to civilization's survival. Losing Eridu would mean losing the administrative centre that kept the water flowing. The Sumerians, arriving into this landscape, would have found cities already positioned at hydraulic choke points, temples already built on the most important administrative sites, and rituals already established to maintain the knowledge of how the system worked. They wouldn't have invented that system. They would have inherited it, learnt it, adapted it, eventually written it down. And when they wrote their history, they would have acknowledged that inheritance by placing the origins of their cities with the gods, because the human origins were beyond their knowledge. This doesn't require believing gods built Eridu. It suggests the Sumerians were accurately reporting what they knew. The city was there before they were, functioning before they arrived, sacred before they recognized it as sacred. Someone established it. Someone organized it. Someone set in motion the system the Sumerians later administered. The texts call that someone the gods, because no human name or human lineage could be attached to those origins. Archaeology confirms the city's age. Texts confirm their pre-Sumerian sanctity. The gap between those facts and what we can prove about the pre-Sumerian period leaves room for the text to be taken seriously as historical memory rather than dismissed as pure mythology. Not literal history. The gods didn't walk earth building temples with divine hands, but historical consciousness, an awareness that civilization came from before, that its origins lay in a time before Sumerian records, and that the proper way to preserve that awareness was to frame it in the language of divine action. The cities named in the pre-flood narratives were real. Their age is confirmed. Their sacred status predates Sumerian civilization. And the texts that describe a time when those cities operated before humanity's creation preserve, at minimum, the Sumerian recognition that their world was inherited, not invented. Whatever happened in those cities before writing documented their activities remains unknown. But something happened. The temples rebuilt 18 times on the same spot at Eridu confirm it. The consistent sacred geography across millennia confirms it. The texts that place humanity's creation late in the sequence, after cities already functioned, confirm it. There was a world before the flood. There were cities before kingship descended the second time. And whatever organisational structure those cities operated under, it was substantial enough to construct temples, maintain waterworks, and establish traditions that survived into the historical period. The Sumerians didn't invent civilization, they inherited it, and they said so repeatedly in every text that describes the time before humanity walked the earth their ancestors came to occupy. 8 kings, 200,000 years. The Weld Blundell prism sits in a climate-controlled case in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. It's a clay prism, 4-sided, standing 8 inches tall, and inscribed on all 4 faces with cuneiform text. Herbert Weld Blundell acquired it around 1922 from an antiquities dealer who claimed it came from Lhasa in southern Iraq, though the exact excavation circumstances remain unclear. Weld Blundell donated it to the Ashmolean in 1923, where it received the catalogue number AN 1923 444. Among the various surviving copies of the Sumerian king list, this prism is the most complete, containing the full sequence from the earliest rulers through the Isin dynasty of the early 2nd millennium BCE. The text begins with a statement. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. What follows is a list of kings and their reign lengths. But the numbers in this opening section are not normal. They don't represent decades or centuries. They represent tens of thousands of years. The first king named is Alulim. The text states he ruled for 28,800 years. His successor Alalangar ruled for 36,000 years. Then Emen-Luana of Batabira, 43,200 years. Emen-Garlana of Batabira, 28,800 years. Dumuzid of Batabira, the shepherd god later famous in Inanna myths, 36,000 years. Ensipaziana of Larak, 28,800 years. Emen-Duana of Sippar, 21,000 years. Ubara-Tutu of Shrupak, 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, total elapsed time 241,200 years. Then the list includes a single line, the flood swept over. After this, the tone shifts. Kingship descended from heaven again, this time to Kish. The post-flood kings have normal human lifespans. The first dynasty of Kish includes 23 rulers, whose reigns range from 8 years to 1,200 years, still implausibly long by modern standards, but within the realm of exaggeration rather than the impossible numbers of the antediluvian section. Scholars have debated the king list's purpose and reliability since its decipherment. The post-flood sections can be partially verified. Kings named in later dynasties appear in other historical records. Gilgamesh of Uruk, listed as ruling 126 years, was likely a real king, though his reign length is clearly inflated. Many rulers from the Akkadian period onward are well documented. The king list becomes increasingly reliable the closer it gets to its own composition date, around 2000 BCE, but the antediluvian section resists verification. No contemporary records document Alulim or Alalangar. No inscriptions from the 5th millennium BCE mention their names. The cities they ruled, Eridu, Batabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, are real and genuinely ancient, but their earliest occupation layers contain no writing. Whatever political organisation existed during the Ubaid period left no textual record. We can't confirm or deny that kings named Alulim and Alangar ruled from Eridu during the pre-flood period, because we have no independent sources to check against. The reign lengths are the real problem. 28,000 years is not human. Even accounting for different calendrical systems, lunar months instead of solar years for instance, the numbers remain absurd. If each year was actually a month, Elulim's reign becomes 20,400 years, still impossible. If each year represents a day, his reign becomes 78 years, plausible for a king, but then why use language that every other context confirms means year in the normal sense? Some scholars suggest the numbers are purely symbolic. In Mesopotamian mathematics, certain numbers had sacred or cosmic significance. The number 60 served as the base for their numerical system, and multiples of 60 appear throughout Mesopotamian timekeeping and measurement. The antediluvian reign lengths are all multiples of 3,600, the square of 60. This might indicate the numbers represent cosmic time, not earthly time, serving a mythological or theological function rather than attempting historical documentation. This interpretation is reasonable. The Mesopotamians used mathematics symbolically as well as practically. Numbers could convey meaning beyond their quantitative value. The suspicious consistency of the antediluvian reign lengths, all neat multiples of 3,600, suggests deliberate construction rather than organic historical record. But if the numbers are purely symbolic, why attach them to a king list that becomes historical in its later sections? The post-flood portions of the king list served administrative and political purposes. They documented legitimate succession, justified royal claims, established the order in which different cities held hegemony. This was functional literature, not purely mythological. Mixing symbolic cosmic time with practical political chronology creates a document that doesn't fit neatly into either category. Another approach is to take the numbers seriously while recognizing they measure something other than individual human reigns. If the antediluvian section represents dynasties rather than individuals, the time spans become more comprehensible. Elulim of Eridu might stand for the entire first dynasty of Eridu, and his reign of 28,800 years might represent the duration that Eridu held hegemony during the pre-flood period. The other names would likewise represent dynasties, and the total of 241,200 years would be the king list's estimate for how long the antediluvian civilization lasted. This reading requires assuming the text uses individual names to represent collective entities, which is not how the post-flood sections work. After the flood, the king list carefully distinguishes between dynasties and individual kings. It lists multiple rulers per dynasty with individual reign lengths that, when added together, give the dynasty's total duration. The antediluvian section doesn't do this. It lists one king per city, then moves to the next city. If these are dynasties, the text isn't following its own later formatting conventions. Yet the alternative, that the Sumerians believed individual human beings ruled for tens of thousands of years, seems equally unlikely. The Sumerians weren't naive. They kept meticulous records. They understood how long human lives lasted. The bureaucratic texts that survive from Sumerian cities document normal lifespans in detail: births, deaths, ages at death, life expectancies. The scribes who compiled the king list weren't ignorant of human biology. They couldn't have believed Elulim literally lived 28,800 years, unless they believed something about the antediluvian period was fundamentally different from their own time. The texts repeatedly mark that era as other. The phrase used, "before the flood," delineates two epochs, before and after. The flood serves as the boundary between them. Before the flood, the world operated under different conditions. After the flood, conditions resembled what the Sumerians knew from their own experience. The impossible reign lengths might be the text's way of signalling that difference. These weren't normal kings. This wasn't normal time. Something about that era doesn't translate into the frameworks that apply to the historical period. The Eridu Genesis supports this reading. After describing the flood and Ziusudra's survival, the text states that the gods shortened human lifespans. The specific passage is fragmentary, but the Atrahasis epic, covering the same event, is clearer. After the flood, Enki proposes modifications to humanity's design. Lifespans will be limited, infant mortality will increase, barrenness will affect some women. These changes are implemented to prevent the overpopulation that led to the flood. The post-flood world operates under different biological constraints than the pre-flood world. If humanity itself was different before the flood, longer lived perhaps, or organised differently, or subject to different divine administration, then the antediluvian kings might have been something other than ordinary humans. Not gods, necessarily, but not human in the post-flood sense either. The king lists in possible numbers would then document real differences in the pre-flood period's organisation, even if the specific numerical values are stylised or symbolic. This interpretation ventures into territory that makes conventional scholarship uncomfortable. It suggests taking the text's claims about pre-flood difference seriously, which opens questions about what exactly was different and how that difference could be possible. Most academic approaches prefer to resolve the problem through purely mythological or symbolic interpretation. The antediluvian section is theological, not historical. It serves to establish divine origins for kingship. The numbers are cosmic decoration. The whole sequence is prologue to the real content, the post-flood dynasties that can be historically verified. But this dismissive approach doesn't explain why the Sumerians structured their king lists this way. If the point was to establish kingship's divine origin, a simple creation myth would suffice. Instead, they created a chronological document that begins in mythological time and gradually transitions into historical time, maintaining the same format and narrative voice throughout. The shift from antediluvian to post-flood sections is marked by a single line, the flood swept over, and then the list continues with the same structure, city names, king names, reign lengths. The continuity of format suggests continuity of intent. The whole document is meant to be read as historical record. Even if the early sections document history, the compiler couldn't verify. Multiple copies of the king list survive, all following the same basic structure. The Weld-Blundell prism is the most complete, but fragments exist from other tablets and prisms. These copies show textual variations, different reign lengths for some kings, different numbers of rulers for some dynasties, but they all include the antediluvian section. All of them begin with kingship descending to Eridu. All of them list the 8 kings with impossibly long reigns. All of them mark the flood as the transition point. This consistency across multiple versions suggests the antediluvian section was considered essential to the document's purpose. What was that purpose? Why did Sumerian scribes working around 2000 BC care about preserving a list of pre-flood kings no one could verify? The political function of king lists is to establish legitimacy. A king claims descent from previous rulers, demonstrating his right to the throne through genealogy. The Sumerian king lists served this function for the Isin dynasty and possibly for earlier dynasties as well. By including the antediluvian section, the compilers were claiming that current kingship descended not just from recent historical dynasties, but from the very beginning of organised civilization, from before the flood, from the time when kingship first descended from heaven. This gives contemporary rulers cosmic legitimacy. Their authority doesn't originate with them or with recent ancestors. It traces back to Eridu, to Alulim, to the moment when gods established kingship as an institution. The impossibly long reigns of those first kings emphasize the institution's antiquity and divine origin. Normal human lifespans would make kingship seem like a recent human invention. Reign lengths of 28,800 years place kingship in mythological time, making it part of the cosmic order rather than a political arrangement humans could challenge or chain. This political function explains why the antediluvian section exists, but doesn't explain why it takes the specific form it does. If pure theological legitimization was the goal, the section could be shorter, vaguer, less specific. Instead, it names 8 individuals, associates them with 5 specific cities, assigns them precise reign lengths, totaling 241,200 years, and then marks the flood as a definitive break. The specificity suggests the compilers were working from source material, trying to preserve information they believed came from tradition older than their own records. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BC-C, compiled his own version of Mesopotamian prehistory for a Greek-speaking audience. His account, preserved in fragments quoted by later Greek historians, includes a king list for the antediluvian period. Berossus names 10 kings instead of 8, and his reign lengths differ slightly from the Sumerian king list, but the basic structure is identical. Before the flood, long-lived kings ruled from ancient cities. The flood ended that era. After the flood, normal history began. Berossus was drawing on Babylonian tradition, which itself derived from Sumerian sources. His version shows that even a millennium and a half after the Sumerian king list was compiled, the memory of an antediluvian period with extraordinarily long-lived rulers remained part of Mesopotamian historical consciousness. This wasn't forgotten mythology. It was information the culture considered important enough to preserve and transmit across languages and empires. The consistency across time is striking. From 2000 BC Sumerian king lists to 280 BC Babylonian chronicles, the same basic account persists. Before the flood, rulers with extreme longevity governed ancient cities. This either represents the most stable mythological tradition in human history, or it represents cultural memory of something real transmitted across more than 2,000 years of political upheaval, language change, and cultural transformation. What might that something real have been? If not literal 28,800-year reigns, then what? One possibility is that the numbers encode information about the duration of a pre-literate civilization. If the antediluvian period represents the time between the first permanent settlements in Mesopotamia around 5400 BC at Eridu and the emergence of Sumerian civilization around 3200 BC with the invention of writing, that's roughly 2,200 years. If the king list compilers knew this period lasted about 2,000 years but had only 8 names preserved from tradition, they might have divided the time period among those 8 names, resulting in reign lengths averaging about 250 years each. But then why multiply those numbers by roughly 100, yielding the 25,000-year average reigns we see in the text? Perhaps the factor of 100 was added deliberately to signal that these aren't normal historical figures. The underlying chronology might be approximately accurate, about 2,000 years before the flood, but the inflated numbers serve to mark those centuries as belonging to a different kind of time than post-flood history. This is speculation. We don't know why the numbers are what they are. We know only that the Sumerians considered them important enough to preserve in multiple copies of an otherwise practical administrative document. We know the antediluvian section was transmitted into Babylonian tradition and eventually into Greek historical writing. We know the cities named are real and genuinely ancient. And we know the whole sequence is meant to explain where kingship came from, how civilization began, and what separated the early period from the later, historical period the Sumerians inhabited. The 8 kings, with impossible reigns, ruled cities before humanity, if we take the creation narratives seriously. They were the divine administrators managing Earth's systems before humans were created to take over that management, or they were the first human rulers, installed after humanity's creation, presiding over a world still organised according to pre-flood principles, or they represent dynasties, coalitions, or administrative periods that the later Sumerian scribes could name but not precisely date, or they are entirely mythological figures serving theological functions with no historical referent at all. Scholarship can't definitively choose between these options because the evidence is insufficient. What remains is the text itself, carefully preserved, asserting that before the flood, 8 kings ruled for a combined 241,200 years. The number is impossible. The claim is consistent across sources, and the cities named were demonstrably ancient, already ruins when the Sumerians first described them. Something happened before the flood. The king list documents it the only way available, by listing names, cities, and numbers that mark the period as fundamentally different from everything that came after. The prism sits in its case in Oxford, the wedge-shaped marks still sharp after 4,000 years. It records what it records. We can dismiss it as mythology, or we can acknowledge that the Sumerians were trying to preserve memory of a time they understood as real, but couldn't fully document. Either way, the text insists there was a before. Kings ruled, cities stood, and when the flood came, that world ended, making way for the one the Sumerians inherited and eventually wrote about. The separation. Before cities, before kings, before humanity, the Sumerian cosmology describes a prior condition, not void, not chaos, but undifferentiation. Heaven and earth existed, but they existed as one entity, Anki, the cosmic mountain, the primordial union from which all else would emerge. The name itself encodes this unity. An means heaven, Ki means earth, and Ki is both, the hyphenated term indicating they formed a single thing rather than 2 separate things. Several Sumerian texts reference this primordial state, though none devotes extensive description to it. The assumption seems to be that the audience already understands the concept, that Anki is foundational cosmology, requiring no elaborate explanation. The texts mention it in passing the way we might mention before the Big Bang, a boundary condition marking the edge of time about which little can meaningfully be said. What matters in Sumerian thought is not Anki's existence, but its separation. The cosmos becomes functional only when heaven and earth are divided, when space is created between them, allowing for movement, action, organisation. The agent of this separation varies across texts, but the most common account credits Enlil, the air god. His name can be analysed as Enlil, which might mean Lord Wind or Lord Storm, or possibly Lord of the Word, depending on how the Sumerian is passed. His domain is Lil, air, wind, breath, the space between things. The logic is straightforward. To separate heaven and earth, you need air between them. Before separation, Anki formed a solid mass. Enlil's intervention creates Lil, space filled with air, the gap that allows heaven to rise and earth to settle. Once separated, An becomes the realm above, Ki becomes the realm below, and Lil, the atmospheric space between them, becomes habitable zone where life can exist. A composition known from multiple tablets found at Nippur describes this separation in mythological narrative. The text is fragmentary, and its modern title varies, Enlil and Ninlil, or the birth of the moon god, but its opening lines establish the cosmological sequence. Enlil separated An from Ki. An took heaven, Enlil took earth. Ki was left as earth's substance. From this division, organised existence became possible. The text doesn't describe this as creation from nothing. The matter already existed. Heaven-earth was already present as Anki. What Enlil did was organise that matter into functional structure. He introduced differentiation where unity had been, establishing the spatial framework within which subsequent events could unfold. This is architectural work, not generative work. Enlil is engineering cosmos, not breathing it into being. After separation, the texts describe assigning domains. An, as heaven, retained the sky realm and the distant stars. Ki, as earth, became the solid ground and the landscape humans would later inhabit. Enlil controlled the air and storms between them. Enki was given the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean beneath Earth's surface. Other deities received specific territories, responsibilities, authorities. The process resembles bureaucratic organisation. Each god allocated a portfolio expected to manage their assigned domain. But this raises the obvious question, who is doing the organising? If Enlil separates heaven and earth, where does he stand while performing this act? He can't stand on earth, because earth doesn't exist yet as separate entity. He can't stand in heaven for the same reason. The only possible location is within Anki itself, which means Enlil must exist prior to the separation he causes. He can't be created by the process because he's the agent causing the process. So where does Enlil come from? The texts don't answer this directly. Some compositions mention Namu, described as the mother who gave birth to all the gods, as a primordial deity existing before Anki, or perhaps as another name for the undifferentiated cosmic matter itself. Namu is associated with water, specifically with the primeval sea from which land emerged. If Namu precedes Anki, then gods could have been born from her before heaven and earth separated. Enlil would be one such god, existing in the primordial state, performing the separation that transforms formlessness into cosmos. But this just pushes the question back. Where does Namu come from? The texts don't say. At some point, Sumerian cosmology reaches a boundary beyond which it doesn't attempt explanation. There is a first condition, however defined, Namu, or Anki, or the Abzu as primeval waters, and from that condition everything else emerges. The gods are part of that emergence, but the earliest gods are not created by anything. They simply are, part of the initial conditions from which cosmos unfolds. This is not unusual among ancient cosmologies. Most traditions eventually reach a point where being is asserted rather than explained. The Greek chaos, the Egyptian nun, the Hebrew tohu wabohu, all are primordial states that exist without cause, serving as the backdrop against which creation occurs. Sumerian thought is consistent with this pattern, and Ki or Namu exists. From that existence, gods emerge. From those gods' actions, cosmos takes structure. The first step is given. Everything else follows. What matters for understanding the before humanity question is that this cosmic structuring happens before humanity exists. The separation of heaven and earth precedes human creation by however many steps. Cities are founded after separation, but before humanity, as previously discussed. Divine labour occurs after separation, but before humanity, as Atrahasis describes. The chronology consistently places human creation late in the sequence. First cosmos is structured, then divine civilization is established, then humanity is created to serve within that civilization. The separation itself marks the beginning of time as distinct from eternity. Before separation, Anki exists in undifferentiated unity, a state without change, without events, without sequence. Once separation occurs, sequence becomes possible. Cause and effect operate. Time flows. This is not time in the human experiential sense. The gods remain timeless, immortal, but it is time in the narrative sense. Stories can be told. Events can be ordered. History, even divine history, begins. Enlil's role in this process gives him tremendous authority in Sumerian theology. He is not the supreme god. The honour belongs to An, who embodies heaven itself, but Enlil is the active executive authority. He makes decisions. He administers earth. He convenes the divine council. When problems arise requiring divine response, Enlil typically takes the lead. He ordered the flood in Atrahasis. He responded to the Igigi rebellion. He manages the cosmos on a practical, day-to-day basis. This administrative role parallels what the texts describe about Eridu and the other pre-flood cities. Divine administration precedes human involvement. The organisational structure exists before humans arrive to participate in it. Enlil, separating heaven and earth, is the first administrative act. Founding cities is a subsequent administrative act. Creating humanity is a later administrative act solving specific problems that arise within the system. Each step follows logically from the previous step's consequences. The Barton Cylinder, the early hymn to the city of K mentioned previously, provides additional detail about post-separation activities. After Enlil separated An from Ki, the text describes land emerging from water, green growth appearing, animals being created, and finally cities being established at locations deemed sacred. The sequence moves from cosmic structure to geographical formation to biological life to urban settlement. Each stage sets conditions for the next stage. Humanity appears nowhere in this sequence. The Barton Cylinder proceeds from city foundation directly to praising the goddess Nintud and describing cultic practices at K. Humans are assumed as the audience. The hymn addresses worshippers, instructs them on proper ritual, but the cosmological narrative doesn't include human origin. We are present by the time the text is being recited, but we are absent from the events the text describes. This pattern repeats across Sumerian cosmological literature. Texts describing cosmic origins rarely mention humanity's creation. That event gets treated separately in compositions like Enki and Ninmah or Atrahasis that focus specifically on explaining why humans exist and what purpose we serve. The cosmological texts are interested in larger structures, how heaven and earth became distinct, how land and sea separated, how gods organized themselves into hierarchies and territories. Human creation is almost an afterthought, relevant to specific narratives, but not to the grand cosmological framework. This relegation suggests something important about Sumerian self-perception. They didn't see humanity as central to cosmic purpose. We aren't the reason the universe exists. We aren't the climax toward which creation builds. We are late additions to a system that was already ancient when we appeared. The texts that describe Anki's separation, Enlil's administration, and divine city building don't need to mention humans because those events occurred before we mattered. We inherit the consequences but didn't participate in the causes. Modern creation myths, particularly those from Abrahamic tradition, tend to make humanity central. The cosmos exists so humans can exist. God creates the world as a stage for human drama. Everything builds toward humanity's appearance and humanity's choices. Sumerian cosmology doesn't work this way. The cosmos exists for its own reasons or for divine reasons. Humanity exists to perform specific functions within an already established system. We are means, not ends. This perspective becomes clearer when reading multiple Sumerian texts in sequence. Enlil separates heaven and earth so that organized existence becomes possible. Cities are founded at sacred locations to serve as administrative centers. Canals are dug to manage water resources. Agriculture is developed to produce food. All of this precedes humanity. The infrastructure exists first. Only when that infrastructure requires maintenance labor that the gods find burdensome do humans get created. We are solutions to problems that arose during divine civilization's operation. If this chronology preserves cultural memory rather than pure invention, it implies something startling. The Sumerians lived in an engineered landscape. The canals that watered their fields were incredibly ancient. The cities they inhabited were built on foundations laid millennia before Sumerian civilization emerged. The agricultural techniques they practiced were inherited, refined from earlier traditions. The entire physical and social structure of their world predated them. They knew this. The archaeological evidence makes it undeniable. So when they told stories explaining their origins, they honestly reported their situation. We arrived late into a world already organized. The separation of heaven and earth, understood as metaphor, describes the emergence of livable space from undifferentiated potential. Understood as transmitted memory, it describes recognition that someone or something organized cosmos before humans could witness that organization. The Sumerians couldn't document who separated heaven and earth, because that event preceded all documentation. They had only cultural memory passed down across generations that there was a time of separation, a time of organisation, a time when the world took its current structure. They attributed those actions to gods, because gods were the only beings they knew of capable of operating before humanity existed. Whether gods, or metaphor, or misunderstood history, the texts are clear about sequence. Separation came first, organisation followed, humanity arrived last, and the world humans inherited, structured, administered, functioning, was the product of work done before we existed to participate in or witness that work. The cosmos the Sumerians inhabited was not a wilderness they tamed. It was a system they entered, learned, and eventually managed. But they managed it as inheritors, not originators. The texts say this explicitly. We just have to decide whether we believe they were describing reality as they understood it, or inventing mythology that coincidentally matches the archaeological evidence of their civilization's borrowed foundations, divine blueprints. The Sumerian term me is difficult to translate. Not because the word is obscure, it appears frequently in texts spanning the entire duration of cuneiform literature, but because no single English equivalent captures its meaning. The me are decrees, but not in the sense of commands issued. They are laws, but not in the sense of legal codes. They are powers, but not in the sense of abilities or forces. They are essences, but not in the abstract philosophical sense. The me are all of these simultaneously, the fundamental principles that allow civilization to function, made tangible, transferable, capable of being possessed, guarded, or stolen. The most extensive catalogue of me appears in a composition known as Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization, preserved on tablets from Nippur and Ur. The text, catalogued in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature as ECSL 1.3.1, describes how the goddess Inanna travelled to Eridu, visited Enki, and through a combination of charm and deception acquired the me that Enki controlled. She then transported these me to her own city of Uruk, making Uruk the centre of civilization. Before describing that theft, the text lists the me. The catalogue includes over 100 separate me, and the list is almost certainly incomplete. The tablets are fragmentary, and scholars suspect more me were originally listed. What survives gives a remarkable picture of what the Sumerians considered the essential components of civilization. The list begins with abstract cosmic principles: En-ship, the office of high priest; Lugal-ship, the office of king; the divine throne; the divine crown. Then it moves through religious functions: great priesthood, Ishib priesthood, Lumar priesthood, the Gedug priest, various types of sacrificial rites. Social institutions appear: truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of prostitution, the art of kissing. Practical crafts follow: metalworking, leatherworking, building, carpentry, basketry. More abstract qualities join the list: wisdom, attention, understanding, fear, reverence, strife, victory, counsel, judgment, decision-making. The impression created by reading through this catalogue is that the me constitute a blueprint for civilization, not just the physical infrastructure, buildings, tools, crafts, but the social and psychological infrastructure as well. Kingship is a me, truth is a me, fear is a me. Each represents a necessary component of organised society, something that must exist and function properly for civilization to operate. The list doesn't describe these components being invented or developed. It describes them existing as discrete entities that can be possessed. Enki, in this narrative, holds the me at Eridu. They are stored there, under his control, guarded in the Abzu. The text isn't explicit about how he acquired them or whether he created them, but the implication is that Enki has custody of civilization's blueprints. As long as they remain in Eridu, Eridu remains civilization's center. When Inanna takes them to Uruk, power shifts. Uruk rises. Eridu's preeminence fades. The story unfolds as a drinking scene. Inanna arrives in Eridu and is welcomed by Enki. He prepares a feast. They drink beer. As Enki becomes intoxicated, Inanna flatters him and he begins giving her me as gifts. The text lists them in groups. First he gives her the crown and throne, then priesthoods, then crafts, then abstract qualities. Each time Inanna accepts graciously and immediately has the me loaded onto her boat. Enki, too drunk to realise what he's doing, keeps offering more me until he's given away over 100 of civilization's fundamental principles. When Enki sobers, he realises what he's done. He sends his servant Isimud to retrieve the me before Inanna reaches Uruk. Isimud catches up to her boat at various stopping points along the journey from Eridu to Uruk. The text names 7 locations, but at each stop, Inanna refuses to return the me. She claims they were gifts, given freely, witnessed by the Abzu and the rivers. Enki has no legal ground to demand their return. By the time Isimud exhausts his arguments, Inanna has reached Uruk. She unloads the me into her city's temples. The transfer is complete. Uruk becomes the new centre of civilization. On the surface, this is a charming mythological narrative explaining political shifts between Sumerian cities. Eridu's early dominance gave way to Uruk's later prominence, and the me transfer story accounts for that change in fortune. The humour of Enki being outwitted by a clever goddess makes the story entertaining. The political function is clear. Uruk's priests and kings claimed legitimate authority because their city held the me, not through conquest, but through divine gift. But beneath that surface narrative, the story reveals important assumptions about how the Sumerians understood civilization. The me are not human inventions. They exist prior to human involvement. They are divine possessions created or held by gods, transferred between gods according to divine politics. When humans practice metalworking or establish kingship or construct buildings, they are not inventing those practices, they are activating me that already exist. Human civilization is the implementation of pre-existing blueprints, not the gradual development of new capabilities through trial and error. This framework makes sense of archaeological anomalies that trouble conventional narratives of civilization's emergence. Sumerian civilization appears suddenly around 3200 BC with the invention of writing. Within a few centuries we have complex urban planning, sophisticated metallurgy, advanced mathematics, astronomical observation, legal codes, religious institutions, monumental architecture. The standard explanation is that these developments occurred gradually during the Proliterate period, and writing simply makes them visible to us for the first time. Archaeological evidence supports gradual development, pottery styles evolve over centuries, building techniques improve incrementally, tool types slowly change. But some elements do appear remarkably fully formed. Sumerian mathematics used a base 60 system that remains through Babylonian transmission, the basis of our timekeeping, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in a circle. This system was sophisticated from the earliest texts that document it. Place value notation, which took other cultures millennia to develop, appears to be inherent in Sumerian numerical writing from the start. The administrative texts from 3200 BC show competent bureaucratic practice, organised record keeping, complex economic calculations, standardised measures. This suggests institutional infrastructure was already functioning when writing began documenting it. Similarly, the legal codes that first appear in writing around 2100 BC with the Code of Ur-Nammu show sophisticated jurisprudence, distinction between capital and non-capital offences, proportional punishment, recognition of intent as different from outcome. These aren't primitive first attempts at law. They're refined legal thought suggesting long precedent. The code itself claims to be restoring older laws, implying legal tradition predating its written form. If the Sumerians thought about civilization in terms of me, pre-existing principles being activated rather than invented, they might have been accurately describing their experience. They inherited a landscape already organised. They learned techniques already developed. They adopted practices already established. Writing, when it emerged, didn't create these practices. It documented them. The me framework acknowledges this. Civilization's components already exist. Gods control them. Humans implement them when gods transfer the me into human custody. The me's transferability is important. They aren't abstract concepts. They're treated as physical objects, or at least as concrete entities that can be moved, given, stolen, stored. Inanna loads them onto her boat. Enki keeps them in the Abzu. This concreteness suggests the Sumerians understood the me as something like knowledge, but not internal knowledge, external knowledge. Knowledge encoded in objects, practices, institutions. When you transfer metalworking me, you transfer the tools, the techniques, the training, the social organisation of smiths, everything necessary for metalworking to function. The me isn't the concept of metalworking. It's the complete package that makes metalworking possible. This sounds remarkably like technology transfer in the modern sense. When a developed nation assists a developing nation with agricultural improvement, they don't just explain farming. They provide seeds, equipment, training programs, organisational models, market access. The full package is necessary. Explaining alone doesn't work. The concept without implementation infrastructure is useless. The Sumerian me might represent this understanding. Civilization requires not just knowing about things, but having the complete systems that make things operational. If the me existed before humanity, as the texts consistently suggest, then someone or something established those systems before humans arrived. The gods, according to the narratives. Divine civilization operated using the me, kingship among the gods, craft production for divine needs, legal frameworks for divine society. When humans were created, certain me were transferred into human custody. We were given the blueprints necessary to maintain the systems the gods had been operating. The me made human civilization possible because they provided ready-made institutional frameworks we could adopt and adapt. This interpretation treats the texts as preserving practical information encoded in mythological language. Divine possession of me represents the reality that Sumerian civilization's fundamental structures predated Sumerian historical records. Human acquisition of me represents the reality that Sumerians inherited rather than invented their civilization. The me transfer stories document the transmission of knowledge across some cultural boundary, whether from pre-Sumerian populations to Sumerian populations, or from earlier eras to later eras, or through some other mechanism the text can only describe as divine gift. Evidence for such transfer exists archaeologically. The Sumerians didn't invent urban life, irrigation agriculture, or monumental architecture. The Ubaid culture practiced all three before Sumerian language and culture emerged. What the Sumerians added was writing, which allowed documentation of practices that previously relied on oral transmission and apprenticeship. Writing didn't create civilization, it made civilization visible to future historians. The Sumerians knew this. They knew their practices were old. The me framework acknowledges the age by locating civilization's origins with the gods, which is another way of saying we don't know when this started, but it was before us. Another composition, Enki and the World Order, Kisi 1113, describes Enki travelling throughout the known world assigning me to various locations and deities. He goes to Sumer and establishes its agriculture. He goes to Ur and establishes its temple. He visits Meluhar, possibly the Indus Valley, and organises its trade. He assigns me for animal husbandry, for fishing, for weaving, for writing. The text presents this as cosmic organisation, Enki establishing the proper function of each region, ensuring the world operates according to divine plan. But embedded in this mythological narrative is practical knowledge. The text knows that different regions specialise in different products. It understands trade routes and economic interdependencies. It recognises that civilization requires multiple specialised activities functioning together. The Me framework organises this complexity into manageable concepts. Each Me represents one necessary function. Enki's assignment of Me represents the organisation of those functions into a working system. If we strip away the mythological language, what remains is a description of how civilization works. Multiple specialised activities, organised according to established principles, coordinated through recognised institutions, producing goods and services that sustain complex society. The Sumerians didn't invent this system ex nihilo. They inherited its structure, possibly modified its details, and certainly documented it extensively once writing became available. The Me represent their conceptual framework for understanding what they'd inherited. The Me also explain why the Sumerians were comfortable with the idea that civilization existed before humanity. If civilization is the implementation of Me, and Me are divine possessions, then divine civilization would consist of the gods implementing Me for themselves. When gods did canals, practice metalworking, establish laws, build cities, all activities Atrahasis and other texts attribute to the pre-human period, they're using the same Me humans would later use. The difference isn't the nature of civilization. The difference is who's operating it. Before humanity, gods operated the Me. After humanity's creation, humans operate the Me under divine supervision. The transfer of labour, documented in Atrahasis, corresponds to a transfer of Me from divine implementation to human implementation. This framework makes the texts internally consistent. The gods had civilization before humans existed. That civilization required work the gods eventually found burdensome. Humans were created to take over that work. Part of taking over the work meant receiving the Me necessary to perform it. Inanna's acquisition of Me from Enki symbolically recapitulates humanity's acquisition of Me from divine custody. The boat journey from Eridu to Uruk parallels the transfer of civilization's operation from divine hands to human hands. Whether this represents historical memory encoded in mythology or pure theological invention matters less than what it reveals about Sumerian self-understanding. They saw themselves as operators of systems they didn't originate. They understood their civilization as transmitted rather than invented. They conceptualized that transmission through the Me divine blueprints that made civilization possible when properly implemented, and they consistently located those blueprints' origins in divine possession, which meant locating civilization's origins in the time before humanity, when gods alone populated Earth and established the infrastructure humans would later inherit. The tablets listing the Me survive in fragmentary condition, like most cuneiform texts, but enough remains to see that the Sumerians catalogue civilization comprehensively. Everything necessary for complex society is included: practical crafts, social institutions, religious practices, abstract principles. The catalogue itself demonstrates sophisticated understanding of what civilization requires. This wasn't naive ancient thinking. This was systematic analysis of social complexity, expressed in a theological framework that acknowledged civilization's antiquity by attributing its origin to deities existing before humanity's creation. The question in the clay. The Conservation Lab at the University of Pennsylvania Museum maintains climate control with obsessive precision. Temperature stays at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 2 degrees. Relative humidity holds at 50%, monitored by instruments that alert staff if variation exceeds acceptable range. These conditions slow clay's degradation, protecting tablets that have survived 4 millennia and might survive 4 more if properly maintained. CBS 10673 rests in a storage drawer designed to minimize handling. The tablet is fragile, not brittle, but vulnerable to oils from human skin, to pressure that might crack weakened areas, to any stress that accumulated age makes dangerous. Conservators handle it rarely, only when scholarship requires direct examination that photography cannot provide. Most researchers work from photographs and published translations, leaving the physical tablet undisturbed in its climate-controlled darkness. The cuneiform marks pressed into CBS 10673's surface remain sharp where the clay is intact. A reed stylus created these impressions 3,700 years ago, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay that was then baked hard. The scribe who wrote this tablet is anonymous. Sumerian scribes rarely signed their work unless producing royal inscriptions or literary compositions meant for prestige. Administrative texts and religious texts bore no attribution. The scribe's hand can be analysed. Specialists recognise individual writing styles, can sometimes identify when the same scribe produced multiple tablets, but the person's name is lost. What survives is what that scribe chose to preserve. The Eridogenesis, as modern scholars call it, the story of cities existing before humanity, the account of kingship descending from heaven, the narrative of divine ordinances being established, the brief mention of mankind being given breath, the flood sweeping over, Ziusudra surviving. This sequence, important enough that someone copied it from older sources, transmitting forward what had been transmitted to them from earlier generations. How many copying generations separated the 1600 B's tablet from the events it describes? If the text preserves historical memory from the Ubaid period, the gap spans at least 2,000 years, 2 millennia of oral transmission before writing existed, then another 1,000 years of written transmission before CBS 1673 was inscribed. 40 or 50 generations of scribes copying older tablets, generation after generation maintaining the narrative because it mattered to preserve this particular account of origins. The question pressed into that clay is simple but profound. What happened here before we arrived? The text answers that question with specifics, cities, kingship, divine ordinances, then humanity. The mainstream interpretation calls this mythology, symbolic narrative serving theological and social functions. The alternative interpretation calls this historical memory, preserved across catastrophic transition, encoding genuine consciousness that Sumerian civilization inherited rather than invented its foundations. Both interpretations can't be simultaneously correct in their full forms. Either the texts are pure invention or they preserve historical consciousness. But perhaps the binary is false. Perhaps the texts do both, invent theological framework while genuinely preserving cultural memory that civilization came from sources beyond direct Sumerian knowledge. The invention would be the gods, the divine actors, the cosmic scale. The memory would be the sequence, the acknowledgement that cities predated Sumerian occupation, that systems predated Sumerian operation, that knowledge came from before. If this reading is correct, the Sumerian texts represent one of humanity's earliest attempts to document historical consciousness. Not history in the modern sense, events with dates and verified details, but consciousness of being embedded in time, of inheriting from the past, of occupying a position in a sequence that extended before living memory. The texts acknowledge limits of knowledge. They honestly report that cities existed before kingship descended. They admit that humanity appears late in a sequence of cosmic organisation. They recognise that wisdom comes from sources beyond present capacity to verify. This honesty is remarkable. It would be easier, more flattering to Sumerian pride, to claim they invented everything, to present Sumerian civilization as originating from nothing, creating writing and mathematics and law ex nihilo through pure genius. Some civilizations made such claims. The Sumerians didn't. They consistently attributed civilization's foundations to sources beyond themselves, to gods, to pre-flood sages, to antediluvian kings, to divine gifts transmitted through catastrophic transition. Whatever their motivation for this attribution, it represents acknowledgement that they were not beginners but continuers. The archaeological evidence supports this self-understanding. The Sumerians did inherit. The cities were old. The irrigation systems predated Sumerian settlement. The basic agricultural and architectural techniques came from earlier cultures. What the Sumerians added was writing, which allowed documentation of inherited knowledge. But documentation is not invention, it's preservation. The Sumerians preserved, and we, inheriting from them, now possess that preservation. The tablets survive. The texts remain readable. The question pressed into CBS 1A673 is still legible. What happened on Earth before humans? The answer the tablet provides is still clear. Cities existed, ordinances functioned, systems operated, then humanity was created to maintain those systems. Whether we accept this answer as historical memory or dismiss it as theological invention, the question itself remains valid. Something did happen before Sumerian documented history began. The Ubaid period existed. Earlier periods existed. Humans lived and organised themselves for millennia before writing documented their activities. We can't know with certainty what those pre-literate people accomplished. We have architecture, pottery, tools, graves, the silent evidence of material culture. We don't have their words, their explanations, their self-understanding. Except perhaps we do. Perhaps the Sumerian texts preserve echoes of that understanding, transmitted across the writing boundary, encoded in stories about gods, because gods were the only available vocabulary for describing knowledge sources beyond living memory. The texts invite us to consider that possibility. They invite us to take seriously the repeated claim that civilization came from before. They invite us to read divine operation as cultural memory of pre-Sumerian sophistication. They invite us to interpret before humanity as before Sumerian documentary visibility. They invite us to acknowledge that absence of written evidence is not evidence of absence, that sophisticated knowledge can exist without documentation, that the boundary between preliterate and literate periods might mark a transition in documentation rather than a transition in capability. This reading doesn't require believing in ancient astronauts or lost super-civilizations or any of the pseudo-archaeological fantasies that exploit gaps in conventional knowledge. It simply requires taking seriously what the Sumerians themselves said about their civilization's origins. They said they inherited. We can believe them. They said knowledge came from before. We can acknowledge that earlier cultures existed with knowledge that transferred forward. They said cities predated Sumerian kingship. Archaeology confirms it. They said systems operated before Sumerian documentation. The irrigation networks existed before writing described them. The mystery is not whether something came before. Clearly it did. The mystery is how much came before. How sophisticated was Ubaid's civilization? What knowledge did they possess? What understanding did they achieve? The absence of Ubaid writing leaves these questions open. The Sumerian texts, if they preserve Ubaid knowledge transmitted across the cultural transition, might be our only window into Ubaid's sophistication. If we dismiss the texts as pure mythology, we lose that window. If we take them seriously as transmitted memory, we might glimpse what came before. The choice of interpretation matters. It affects how we understand civilization's emergence. If Sumerian civilization invented itself, the narrative is one of human genius, creating something from almost nothing. If Sumerian civilization inherited foundations from sophisticated predecessors, the narrative becomes one of perpetuation, of maintaining and building upon transmitted knowledge. Both narratives honour human achievement, but they honour different achievements: invention versus preservation, innovation versus perpetuation, beginning versus continuation. The texts choose perpetuation. They frame Sumerian civilization as continuation of something older. They honour the knowledge sources, divine or pre-flood, that made Sumerian achievement possible. They acknowledge debt to those who came before. This acknowledgement suggests maturity, humility, historical consciousness that recognises present accomplishment rests on past foundations. CBS 10673 will outlast our interpretations. The clay is more patient than theory. In another century, scholars might read the same wedge-shaped marks and reach different conclusions. The evidence doesn't change, but understanding evolves. What remains constant is the question the tablet preserves. What happened on Earth before we arrived? The Sumerians answered according to their knowledge and understanding. They said cities existed, systems functioned, knowledge accumulated, then humanity was created to maintain what had been established. We can accept that answer as encoded memory. We can dismiss it as mythology. We can remain uncertain, acknowledging evidence insufficient for definitive conclusion. But we cannot escape the question itself. Something did come before. The earth we inherited bore marks of prior organisation. Cities stood on ancient foundations, techniques were traditional, knowledge was transmitted. These are facts independent of interpretation. How we explain these facts determines whether we see ourselves as inventors or inheritors, as beginners or continuers, as isolated moderns or latest links in chains extending deep into time before writing documented the connections. The tablets invite inheritance. They model preservation. They demonstrate that knowledge can survive catastrophic transition if someone deliberately carries it forward. They prove that clay and careful copying outlast empires. They remind us that what seems ancient to us seemed ancient even to those who lived 4,000 years ago. There has always been a before. There will always be questions about what happened during that before. And there will always be those who preserve what knowledge survived the gaps, who maintain the transmission, who carry forward what came from earlier into the present, and toward whatever future inherits from us. Rest now, knowing that questions can remain open, that mysteries need not resolve, that the clay beneath Philadelphia will keep its marks and its secrets with equal patience, waiting in darkness for whoever comes next to ask what happened here before we arrived.